carbon emissions by 2050. Nearly 70% of all Americans are in favor of pursuing a carbon neutral America by 2050. And 31% believe that we should phase out the use of all fossil fuels completely by 2050. Global warming has become an increasingly popular topic of debate, with some people even dedicating their lives to attempting to reverse its effects. But what most people don't realize when it comes to the topic of carbon neutrality is the cost. The cost to achieve a carbon neutral world by 2050 is a lot larger of an undertaking than most people realize. To define a few terms, net carbon zero and carbon neutral can be used interchangeably, and they both mean that no net release of carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is bad because in theory it traps heat in the atmosphere. I also talk a lot about the research journal Net Zero by 2050, a pathway for the global energy sector. Headed by the International Energy Administration, the NZE for short, is a peer-reviewed science-backed pathway on how we might possibly gain net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But anyone who reads the document in its entirety will quickly come to the conclusion that there is no way in which this would be feasible. The first commercially successful internal combustion engine can be dated back to 1861. A Belgian inventor by the name of Etienne Lenoir developed the engine and implemented it in 1862 with the creation of the first internal combustion automobile. The creation of an advanced fossil fuel burning engine paved the way for today's advanced fossil fuel burning economy. And for good reason. Fossil fuels are reliable. But they do have some drawbacks. Fossil fuels emit pollution, and the pollution emitted by these fossil fuels has resulted in an ongoing debate on how do we minimize and regulate this pollution. Today, the debate has evolved to how do we not only minimize pollution, but how do we get rid of it entirely? From electricity production, the world's largest governments, including our own, believe that attempting to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is the best course of action to take to ensure Earth's longevity. Just as God told Adam to take care of the Garden of Eden, so we are to take care of the earth. But I believe that attempting to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is not the best course of action for our earth or for the citizens of the world. Roadblocks, soup throwing, superglue. What do all these things have in common? Protests, specifically Just Stop Oil protests. Just Stop Oil protests have recently been gaining traction among environmental conservationists and climate change activists alike, especially in Western Europe. I'm sure you have all seen this group committing acts of vandalism, such as throwing soup at the Mona Lisa, or gluing their hands to the road, traffic, all in an attempt to get their point across, which is to tell oil companies to just stop producing oil. Life is roadblocks, but the roadblocks caused by these protesters only negatively leaves an impact on the lives of others on a daily basis. Though this group is adamant in fighting for a greener future, they do not truly understand the cause for which they are fighting. Whoever wants to live a better life will not find it in the NZE. Whether we are looking for satisfaction in lowered electricity costs, or anticipating the adoption of clean energy practices, attempting to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 would leave us with much to be fulfilled. And not only would it leave us wanting more, but it is unachievable for a multitude of reasons. In order to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, there are 6 sectors that need to be addressed: technological innovation, active decarbonization of energy, carbon removal, behavioral changes in policies, reduction of the oil industry, and lastly, government agencies around the world will need to be working in collaboration with the goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Now, just by looking at all the broad categories that need to be addressed should show someone how unlikely it is that we would be able to design and implement all the necessary innovations in a span of the next 26 years. So is it worth pursuing net zero carbon emissions by 2050? The answer is no. There are many reasons for this. Firstly, the technological innovation needed to achieve net zero carbon emissions involves a large amount of time and money. The burning of fossil fuels and coal to generate electricity has led electricity to become one of the largest polluting sectors in the energy industry. In fact, electricity production accounts for 36% of all energy-related emissions today. And due to the pollution from electricity production, this means we would have to implement solar, wind, hydroelectric, and geothermal power plants to generate new, clean electricity. But these are all costly and come with potential weaknesses. It is estimated that the cost to go to the necessary level of renewable energy just in America would be roughly $800 billion per year, compared to the $260 billion we spent on electricity in 2020. Also, there are days when the sun doesn't shine and there are days when the wind stands still. Renewable energy is simply unreliable. So in order to make a renewable grid, a large complex system of energy storage batteries would be needed. Currently, there are 18 gigawatts of battery storage available globally, but this number would need to be increased to over 3,100 gigawatts of battery storage if we were to reliably support a renewable grid. Along with the topic of electricity production, there is an estimated near 300% increase in the production of electricity. There are a few reasons for this, one of them being the transportation industry going full electric. By 2035, we would need to ban the sales of all fossil fuel burning vehicles. But this is a problem, as in 2023, we saw a 50% decline in growth in the sales of electric vehicles. Manufacturers are not making the profits they would have hoped, and consumers are not buying as many EVs as anticipated. Along with the topic of EVs, there are many drawbacks associated with their mainstream implementation. An electric vehicle only gets 300 miles of range on average. So due to the nature of having to repeatedly charge an electric vehicle, optimization of the current power grid would be costly but necessary. Also, electric vehicles only surpass fossil fuel burning vehicles in emissions reduction at 40,000 to 90,000 miles. There are a few reasons for this, with the main one being pollution from battery manufacturing. This means it could take up to 9 years of driving an electric vehicle for it to become cleaner than its fossil fuel burning vehicle counterpart driven the same amount of distance. This is not a horrible statistic, but it is one that is necessary to refine if we want to pave a carbon neutral road for our transportation system in the future. And if we want to be able to handle an increase in electricity consumption, the grid also has to be able to handle the increase. Electricity usage jumps from 27,000 terawatt hours in 2020 to over 71,000 terawatt hours in 2050. And since electricity production accounts for 36% of all energy-related emissions, this means that not only do we have to produce nearly 3 times the amount of electricity, but we have to do so all in a way which reduces our carbon emissions. The next development would be the development of carbon capture utilization systems. CCUs include direct carbon capture and storage of captured carbon. CCUs are already under development, but it will still take many more years before they are ready to be implemented into mainstream industry. Next, consumer behavior and policy changes must be made. Consumer behavior plays a big role in the NZE, as it is ultimately the consumers who make the switch from fossil fuel systems to renewable ones. People must do things like convert homes to zero carbon homes, help fund a renewable grid, switch from fossil fuel systems to electric ones, and pay for all of this through tax dollars and personal investment. Governments would also have to incentivize net zero adoption by implementing things such as gas taxes and carbon taxes. Next, the oil industry in America currently contributes 312 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere per year. But due to things like the plastics and aviation industry, it is impossible to get rid of the oil industry. Therefore, the only way to further reduce oil industry emissions is to utilize even more carbon capture utilization systems. And lastly, all the changes and advancements of new technology need to be shared among the world's largest and smallest governments. It is mandatory that all governments work together to help incentivize people to accept net zero carbon adoption. But due to the nature of governments being at odds with each other, it is unlikely that this would ever happen. Many countries have already pledged to go net zero by 2050, but very few have actually started to implement change. Along with the topic of electric vehicles, many people don't know about how the cobalt is mined for use in electric vehicle lithium-ion batteries. 74% of all the cobalt mined in 2023 came from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Miners are using whatever they can find to mine the cobalt with, from shovels and pickaxes all the way to scraps of rebar. Miners are gathered into cramped pits, mining the materials necessary for use in our phones, our energy storage systems, and most importantly, our electric vehicles. This turns the problem of electric vehicles from an economic issue into a moral issue. Many historians are calling this modern-day slavery. An all-electric future should not rely on slave mines like these. And if we want a sustainable network of electric vehicles in our future, then this problem needs to be addressed. And though switching from humans to machines would be costly and result in more carbon emissions, it is a necessary step we must take. Global warming advocates stand on the belief that global warming is a real issue. Global warming can be defined as a long-term increase in Earth's temperature, which some believe is largely caused by carbon pollution in the Earth's atmosphere. Climate change is the belief that the Earth is changing to an undesired state due to human negligence. Believers in this ideology say we must achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, since our carbon emissions and pollution right now are causing global warming. But these people are misinformed in their beliefs. Many proponents of global warming would say the Earth has been increasing 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since 1880. But this is too specific a number and too specific a time period to be believable. Not only because of the lack of instrumentation available to measure global temperatures since 1880, but because of the lack of samples and documentation of global temperatures. The way to measure global temperatures is by taking near-surface air measurements on land and water. But the number of measurements needed to be taken to get an average global temperature reading is far too many to be accurate. This means millions of measurements near land, millions of measurements near air, near water, which is millions of measurements of air. And this ideally would be taken many times throughout a single day. This leaves a lot of room for error. Even experts make note that there is only a 50% chance that global warming exists, such as the scientists who developed the NZE. And if there is one group qualified to make the claim that right now global warming is at best a toss-up, then the International Energy Agency is this group. Global warming advocates also stand on the belief that climate change has already led to issues like droughts and wildfires. But these things are not true. According to the United States National Park Forest Service, 85% of wildland fires in the US are caused by humans. The rest are caused by natural phenomena such as lightning. In recent years, California has seen an increase in wildfires, but this is due to California's poor forest management system. In the Northeast, it is common to practice proper forest management by doing things such as cutting fire breaks, clearing out brush that is at risk of spreading a fire, and allowing trees to be chopped down. In California, the environmental and forest management techniques are based on abstract theories which are not connected to reality, and thus they experience far more forest fires than the North. In California, they suppress fires and allow highly flammable brush to pile up, basically building the ideal conditions for a statewide bonfire. And California's wildfires are not unique to today. Many years prior to European settlement, Native American tribes and lightning burn an estimated 2 to 5 million acres minimum of land in California every year. And as for places like Australia, who have also suffered recent wildfire damage, it is a similar situation in that they have always had wildfires, and the wildfires they are experiencing are nothing new. Wildfires, then, are not an issue of global warming, they are an issue of poor land management. And as for droughts, they also are not caused by global warming. According to the EPA, who has been thoroughly studying droughts since the beginning of the 20th century, droughts occur in a predictable up and down cycle. Droughts are a common occurrence in history, dating back to even biblical times, and are not a result of global warming. And trying to attain net zero carbon emissions by 2050 would also not make the cost of living any cheaper. Electric vehicles become more expensive, electricity becomes more expensive to produce, and carbon removal becomes more expensive. Thus, trucking and transportation becomes exponentially more expensive, which increases the cost of everything. The reason it is exponential is because the majority of efficiency gains are made early on, such as with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels might not be carbon neutral, but they are cheap to run. As you start aiming for less emissions, you have to do away with fossil fuels and switch to renewables. And renewables are ridiculously expensive. And how do we know this? Take a look at Siemens and General Electric. In the first half of 2023, Siemens reported a loss of $5 billion, and General Electric reported a loss of $1 billion on each of their respective wind farms. Maintenance costs were high, and the electricity generation rate was much lower than expected, thus leading to massive losses. Even more recently, two major wind project developers are going to pay substantial amounts of money to get out of their existing contract to sell power to ratepayers. Avangrid, developer of the 1,200 megawatt Commonwealth Wind Project, is going to pay $48 million to get out of their existing contract. They do this so that way they can rebid the same project next year at an even higher price. Developers of the 1,200 megawatt South Coast Wind Project are going to pay $60 million to get out of their existing contract. These companies have all realized that renewable energy is expensive and that to make it worth their time, they're going to need billions of dollars in government subsidies. According to the American Clean Power Association, 2022 saw 16% less new wind power capacity than 2021. This is due to projects like Sunrise Wind Project and Ocean Wind projects being too expensive. These companies have all stated that in order to continue their green energy projects, they're going to need to have the ability to write off billions of dollars in losses. And the wind energy sector is not the only green energy sector already facing issues. Auto manufacturers of electric vehicles are already facing massive losses, especially in 2023. Ford, in the first half of 2023, reported a loss of $60 billion per electric vehicle sold. Rivian likewise reported a loss of nearly $63,000 per electric vehicle sold in the first quarter of 2023, though they were able to reduce this number to a mere loss of $37,000 per electric vehicle sold in the second quarter of 2023. A gradual switch to renewables is what should happen, as the cost is not incurred all at once. Many people think the benefits of going net zero carbon emissions by 2050 outweighs the costs, but they do not truly know the costs nor the benefits. Attempting to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is an expensive idea and too soon of a deadline to be worth pursuing. Thank you. I would now like to open the floor for questions. Yes.
A great presentation, really good job.
Thank you.
Well done. If you were to suggest something we could or should be doing in the next 20 to 30 years, what would you suggest?
So a lot of people, are buying electric vehicles right now, and a lot of people like electric vehicles. And if you're looking for a new car, an electric vehicle really is a great option, low maintenance. And, eventually we'll get to a point where they really help to start reducing our carbon emissions. Battery manufacturing will get more efficient. The more green power plants we get, or more nuclear power plants we get to help generate cleaner electricity, means the time for the break-even period of electric vehicles goes down. So ultimately, buying an electric vehicle is a good idea, and I do support them. And solar panels are also a good option too, as eventually they'll be a good return on your investment. And so those are two things that I think are pretty good to be doing. Mr. Girotti.
Mitchell, do you have a sense of your argument is against the year 2050?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense based on what you looked at? Is there a year you could replace for 2050? Any idea of what a better, a more reasonable time frame would be?
That's a really good question, because everything I mentioned is doable. It just takes a lot of money mainly, and the research and development that has to go into each one of these different sectors is almost unfathomable. But I think there will be a year when we'll be able to achieve net zero carbon emissions, but I think that's way beyond 2050, maybe 2100. I'm not sure when the year is, but it's achievable. I'm just not sure when. Chris.
Mitchell, great job. First of all, very informative.
Thank you.
I just was wondering about carbon capture. Did you happen to read any of the dangers of carbon capture?
I didn't read too much of the dangers of them, I just read a lot about the costs and all the technology that goes into them. And I know Louisiana pretty recently signed a bill where they wanted to get funding for their own carbon capture utilization system, and but it was going to be however millions or billions of dollars. So I'm not too aware of the dangers, but I know one of the big factors is the cost. So even if you can overcome that cost, I'm sure there are a lot of dangers involved with them. Mr. Bowen.
Wondering, you mentioned that transitioning from fossil fuels to electric was impractical, primarily for a large part due to utilization in the aviation and plastic industry.
Mhm.
And I was wondering why exactly that is.
Yeah, so everything you see on a day-to-day basis is based on the oil industry. Right now, trucking, it's impossible to replace uh, trucks with electric vehicles. Just right now, we don't have the technology. And even if we could, the oil industry is so involved with plastics and things like that, like this camera, your glasses, everything, probably like 50% of your clothes, everything has petroleum or some sort of natural gas, or not natural gas, but petroleum, something in there. And so it's just impossible to get rid of it unless we want to find some sort of new breakthrough material to use in all of our day-to-day lives. It's just, you can't get rid of it.
So yesterday, President Biden set aside $7 billion for solar panels for low-income housing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good idea, bad idea. How could that go bad? How might that contribute to what you're talking about?
Yeah, so that's a lot of money to be putting into one thing right now. And ultimately, if we had the funds and we weren't in such crippling debt, it might be a good idea. But I guess another problem I have with it is it's coming from the Biden administration, and all these laws and bans are coming from the Biden administration and not Congress. Uh, I really think Congress should be the ones making the laws about what we are trying to do for to achieve net zero carbon emissions, whereas the Biden administration is able to make a lot of things based not too much on research. Um, so I think things like that, just spending billions of dollars on green energy projects when we can't sustain the rest of the industry, is not too great of an idea right now, though it is a step in the right direction.
And the second question, how long does it take to replace a battery for EV? Because if it takes 40 to 90,000 miles just to recapture the environmental usefulness, seems like batteries have to be replaced quite frequently.
Yeah, so there's been some debate about where the break-even period is, and that depends on your make and model and where you are geographically. But yeah, if you have to replace a battery before 100,000 miles, you could be looking at an over 150,000 mile break-even period for an electric vehicle. So like if your battery fails, um, it's going to take multiple owners of the same electric vehicle for it to ever become cleaner than a fossil fuel burning vehicle.
Great job.
Thank you.
First off, you've probably learned a lot of things about this in the last year that
Mhm.
you didn't know a year ago. Based on that, what do you think the biggest gap between net zero 2050 in reality and the public perception of what's going on is?
So everyone wants to achieve lower pollution and less carbon emissions for one reason, and that's to take care of the earth. And so taking care of the earth is obviously like a noble and worthy achievement to strive towards. But the thought that global warming is real and irreversible by 2050, I think is the biggest misperception. Because you talk to anyone that's never really looked into it, they don't know the data, they haven't looked into it, and they don't see where all the holes in the reasoning are. So it's just hard to make a convincible argument that global warming is real. And for all the reasons I stated in my paper, it doesn't seem to be a real threat.
Okay. One more question. So you started this about a year ago. How has the narrative in the news cycle changed or evolved in the 1 year that you've been working on this? And where do you see that potentially being in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I've heard a lot of talk about, mainly electric vehicles, people wanting to ban fossil fuel burning vehicles, 2035. Now some were saying 2030, some even earlier, like in places like in California. Um, and people are really just wanting to push this full electric, carbon neutral homes, this electric future. But they're not doing it in a sustainable way. And so I think like in places like California, who suffered blackouts pretty recently, because they were trying to switch off their fossil fuel powered power plants and switch to renewables, they couldn't sustain it. They couldn't get enough power out of the renewable systems, and they shut off their fossil fuel burning power plants. So they were in a pretty bad state. So I think trying to make this super aggressive push right now, it's just what we've seen. It doesn't work. You can't do it right now. It's not sustainable.
I have another question. This is kind of basic, actually. How should a Christian care about the environment?
That's a good question. So, God, He told Adam to be fruitful and multiply, and to fill the earth and subdue it. And so, I think we have a duty to take care of God's creation and recognize where we are failing and where we are, falling short. But then also realize that some things we might not be actually harming the environment. And so some things we can kind of take a step back and look and say, this is bad for the environment. This is good. And so, maybe, the fossil fuel powered power plants, like the coal ones, those are pretty bad. But even if we just switch to natural gas power plants or nuclear, those are all very clean, very low carbon emissions, and they're not renewable sources of energy, but very sustainable and pretty much very clean compared to, places like China, who are producing a third of the world's emissions. So America, we're doing a pretty good job at reducing our carbon emissions right now. And so for a Christian to look at it that way, realize that we are doing pretty good right now, and that just be conscious about what you're doing,
So one more maybe basic question on that. So what if you were with someone who said, "Hey, Mitchell, I'm actually compelled by your argument, but I think that holding the goal actually builds more momentum and gets more support. Whereas if we just do away with maybe an unattainable goal, then people are just going to say we're not working for anything. Like, kind of, I'm just going to throw in the towel and not care about it." What would you say to someone who maybe behind closed doors is saying like, "Okay, I'm compelled by your case, but I want to have like a high goal because anything worth doing costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time."
Mm-hmm.
What would you tell that person?
It's a really good question. Maybe we should set a goal, maybe a later deadline, maybe like 2100, because right now, I talked about California and other places who are switching from fossil fuel to renewables, and then the grid can't handle the load, and so they get days of blackouts. So pushes and super aggressive movements like that can actually be dangerous, as we've seen, for people that are relying on electricity or hospitals. That was a pretty big problem in California. And so I think we keep making that push, but maybe like you said, we make a deadline, we stick to it, and then we avoid those risks, but we still are pursuing the worthy goal.
So then a follow-up question, two things. Why'd they pick 2050? And secondly, like, what would you say to people who would say, well, like, the people I'm trying to get on board won't care in 2100.
Yeah.
And why 2050?
So the big belief, people said 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since 1880 is how much the Earth was rising in temperature. And so the scientists estimated that by 2050, the Earth would have risen so much in temperature, it would be irreversible. But I don't believe that to be the case. A day, it just changed upwards of 30 degrees in temperature just the other day in Louisiana. And it's not uncommon to see, 50-degree temperature changes. So unless you're measuring every point on the Earth and not just filling in holes in the ocean, where there's lack of data, or on the map and accounting for outliers and all these different factors, it's hard to make, that 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit number believable. And what was your other question?
No, that's
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Mitchell, I think you've done an excellent job.
Okay.
Thank you very much.